Presenting my screen. And here we go. All right, everybody can see that, yes? I'll take your silence as a yeah, Mr. Pieper, we can see that. Okay, cool. I know that I've said this ad nauseum to you before, and I'm sure a lot of you are like, yeah, Mr. Pieper, we get it now, but I'm still getting questions, and I understand that not everybody's made every single Google Meet. So I just want to reiterate that attendance is not tied to your grade. So it's not like I'm trying to tell you, I obviously want you to be here because I think it's helpful for you to see this stuff live, and you can ask questions and, you know, be a part of the interaction. So it's obviously important that you are here. Now, if I mark you absent, it's only because I didn't, or excuse me, you weren't at the Google Meet. That's the only thing that it means. And it doesn't mean that you, that if you have an unexcused absence on your grade, that is tied to, or excuse me, if you have an unexcused absence, that's tied to anything, okay? So just understand that. Then we are going to get into a little Quizlet Live. I know that sounds a little goofy, like how the heck are we going to do that from a distance setting? I've done it with my other classes and it actually worked pretty well in that you need to review for the terms quiz today. That'll be at the end of class here. Then I'm going to introduce the American Revolution. This is going to be the tiniest lecture you've ever seen in your life. I'm going to give you just a brief intro because in U.S. History A, you should at least have some context about the American Revolution, especially since we spent a good amount of time talking about the formation of American government and how we went from, you know, the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So you at least have a little bit of idea about that type of stuff. So I just want to give you some of the context dealing with the American Revolution. Then we're going to take a look at something called History Alive or Guided Notes, where you're going to have a reading and you'll have to apply it to a sheet that I will get started with you today. I'll show you how to do the first sheet, and then you will have to do the remainder yourselves. Then we'll take that term quiz, or excuse me, then I'm going to introduce the new terms to you. You're going to need to make sure that you know where those are because, well, I should have changed this. This should say Wednesday, Thursday next week, not Thursday, Friday, okay? But on Wednesday, Thursday next week, particularly for this class, it would be Thursday, you're going to be taking your next term quiz, okay? And then we are going to take that term quiz slash bigger chunks quiz that we studied up on yesterday. So just a refresher, this is what the bigger chunks quiz is going to look like today. So when you see these specific, this is the exact picture that I use on the quiz. So you'll need to tell me which, you know, that number 2 is the Treaty of 1783. Okay, you'll need to tell me that number 5 is the Louisiana Purchase. So this will just be one big matching question, okay? This was the key that I taught you with, but this is what the actual quiz is going to look like. Okay, so here's what I would like everybody to do, okay? If you have another device, like you have your, you have a phone on you, or you have like a spare like desktop, or you have like maybe you're not on your iPad, I don't know. But if you have a spare device, I want you to open up a Safari window or a Google Chrome window or whatever. Maybe you're still on Internet Explorer or something, I don't know. But go to a web browser and I want you to go to Quizlet.live right now. Go to Quizlet.live. And what you are going to do is you're going to type in that code right there. Okay, we're going to play this individually. This actually worked pretty well with my other classes. It might be a colossal failure, but hey, that's just distance learning, right? So Quizlet.live, and then type that in right here. I'm just going to peek over and see how many we did have. Okay, so we had 29. I'll give you about just a minute here. Looks like we have 2 still out, but we'll give you just 1 more minute to figure it out. And if you don't get to play the review game, it's not a big deal. It's okay. Okay, we're going to play this game. We're going to play 3 rounds of it, and then we're going to move on. So here we go. These are your spirit animals, folks. They've been chosen with a deliberate purpose. And they're racing. Wow. All right, here we go. Round 2. Same spirit animals, and they're racing. T-Rexes, chameleons, and tigers. Ooh, pumas are in there too. T-Rexes by 2 lengths. Coming around the home stretch. And it's T-Rexes again. Wowee. Amazing you can run that fast with those tiny arms. All right, here we go. This one's for all the Tostitos. And they're racing. This is it, folks. Isn't anybody going to catch the T-Rexes? Wowee. Ho, 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 ho. Reindeer by an antler. Nice job. Wowee. All right. So hopefully that was a good review for those of you that did study, and those of you that didn't study, you were able to at least see them once before you take the quiz. All right, here we go. So let's take a look at what Schoolio looks like for you. And I'm going to use it. I'm going to view this as a student. Okay, so this is what Schoology looks like to you. So later when we take that foreign policy quiz, it'll be under this this foreign policy folder. Okay, I opened up the Revolutionary War folder because we're going to introduce this stuff here today. Here are your here are your 2 Quizlet links. Okay, I put one with pictures and one without pictures. You study with whatever makes sense to you. Some feedback that I got from kids last time around was, the Quizlet has pictures, but the quiz doesn't. It'd really be nice if it didn't, so that I didn't, study the pictures instead of the words. Okay, so you've got both here. Take a look at whichever makes sense to you. In this lecture tab here, this is the lecture that I would typically do if we had a traditional classroom setting and we were able to study the American Revolution. And this is what you are going to be working on for me starting today. And you can see right over here on your calendar that you have got that coming up. Already due next Tuesday. Okay, due next Tuesday. Now, your class meets on Tuesday, so that's why I'm making it due on Tuesday. Make sure that you get that turned in before the end of the day Tuesday, as well as your foreign policy spectrum Dropbox, which, don't let me forget, if you have any questions about that, stick around at the end of class. So let's go right back to now. We are just kind of introducing the American Revolution and understand that this relationship of colonists versus the British in the American Revolution had a great deal to do with some of that foreign policy stuff that you were studying. Particularly, you could take a look at the role of the British as being the role of the imperialists, okay? More specifically, you could say it was colonialism, and colonialism and imperialism, I would say, kind of fall under the same umbrella. It's basically controlling other nations. Colonialism, you're basically saying that you are a part of the empire. You are a part. So for the colonies, they were a part of Great Britain, or so they thought. But the rub with them was that they weren't treated as equals as a part of the empire. So people that lived in Boston didn't feel like they had the same rights as somebody living in London. Okay, they were able to call themselves British. They spoke English. They did everything culturally just like them, but they had no voice in government, and they really didn't feel like they were being treated as equals. Furthermore, something that I want to mention is something that I talked extensively about in U.S. History A, which is the notion of deference. Deference is the concept that some people are born of noble status and some people are not. And kind of the fad of the times that kind of came out of the Enlightenment was a concept of equality. The notion that people aren't born of noble status and that people are truly supposed to be of equal status. Okay, back in this time period, if you were walking down the streets of Boston and somebody of noble status was walking across the street from you, you were supposed to bow, and you were supposed to bow your hat to them to show deference, to show that they were of superior, they were noble. Okay, so anyway, this is how it's going to go down. First, there's trouble with Britain in terms of taxes and in terms of representation, and then they're going to start fighting, and then we'll get to the Declaration of Independence. So it largely had to do with that control. Okay, who is controlling the colonies? Okay, and that independence was what they were looking for. So here, just kind of the order of events of things that you probably have heard of, but I'm just hoping that you have in context before we actually study the American Revolution, were some of the early acts that had to do with taxes. Okay, the British needed money because they had paid for the French and Indian War, and they had paid for all this new land that the colonists were able to use, but they were bankrupt, and they had to pay for it. So they imposed some new taxes, and colonists were upset that they weren't given an option, okay, to, they didn't have a say in where these taxes were coming from. It was just imposed on them, okay? 1770, you've got the Boston Massacre. Hopefully you can remember from your middle school history that, even the name Boston Massacre was a little over the top. When you hear massacre, hopefully you're thinking that more than 5 people were, died from the incident. There were a lot more injured, but a lot of the propaganda from the time, specifically that made by Paul Revere, was made to lead the colonists on that it was a little more than what it was. And if we had a traditional classroom setting, we would actually take a look at a reenactment of the Boston Massacre, in which, the colonists went up to these armed guards. I mean, imagine going up to an armed policeman today and taking an ice ball and throwing it in their face and expecting them not to return that aggression back. Okay, now obviously we have different rules for policemen and for the army and that type of stuff now, but Yeah, anyway, here we go. So on to the Boston Tea Party. As you well know, the British had an extensive empire. There was the saying that the sun never sets in the British Empire, and it was truly that. You know, the British had an empire in India, and in India they were a part of the East India Tea Company, and they had this influx of tea, and they brought that to the colonists in the Americas, thinking, hey, they'll really like this, and this will make them feel more British since they can drink our tea. And the colonists got upset that they only had one option for tea, even though it was cheaper. They, in a form of protest, they went out to the boat in the middle of the night. It wasn't like this picture here. It wasn't like this huge protest where people could see it. They snuck on there and threw it out of the boat. And it was more like a plop plop as opposed to a big party. Anyway, all right. So from there we go to 1774 and the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress was just kind of like, hey, how should we independent colonies from one each other? Okay, and these, Virginia and North Carolina, they really didn't have anything in common. They kind of try to decide how we're going to handle this thing, because they're a bunch of independent colonies that really had nothing to do with one another. Well, from there, the First Continental Congress, they decided we're going to impose force on the British. We are going to make this into a battle. From there, you've got the battles of Lexington and Concord, the symbolic first battles of the American Revolution. To this day, we still don't know who fired the first shot. And then 1776, as you well know, July 4th, we've got the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence is, if I was to ask you what it is, you'd probably just say, well, it was just a declaration saying that we had gained our independence from Britain, and that's obviously right in the title. But what's significant about the Declaration of Independence are those words that resonate. The notion that all men and women later are created equal. Okay, that's what resonates. That's why it's significant. So what I would like you to do now, folks, is I would like you to go right back to Schoolio. So go back to Schoology, and you've got two PDFs. You've got one here that's called your Chapter 7 Guided Notes. And I want you to take that and put it into Notability. Then I want you to take this one, the History Alive Reading, and open that bad boy up. You might want to download it just so you can expand it and take a closer look at it. I'm going to do that right here just so you can see it a little bit better on my screen. Okay. And I am going to slide this over like this so that hopefully you can see. All right. So I'm going to read for you 7.1. Now, this is just an introduction to what we're going to be talking about. We're actually going to do something with 7.3 when we finally get to that. So for the time being, like I said, just have that available into Notability. We're not going to do anything with that quite yet, but right now I would just like you to listen as I read. So here we go. 7.1. When the American War for Independence from Great Britain began in 1775, 15-year-old Joseph Martin was too young to join the Continental Army. But when recruiters returned to his Connecticut village a year later, he was ready to go. The recruiters were looking for volunteers to go to New York, where the British were rumored to have 15,000 troops. I did not care if it had been 15 times 15,000, Martin said later. I never spent a thought about numbers. The Americans were invincible, in my opinion. Just 2 days after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Martin traded his plow for a musket, an early type of rifle. A week later, he arrived in New York City, where he hoped to sniff a little gunpowder. As he recalled, I was now what I had long wished to be, a soldier. I had obtained my heart's desire. It was now my business to prove myself equal to my profession. If Martin had known what lay ahead, he might not have been so pleased about his new profession. The Army in New York was ill-trained, ill-equipped, and just plain ill. Almost the whole regiment was sick, reported a Massachusetts officer in his unit. The British Army, in contrast, was well-trained, well-equipped, and well-supported by the British Navy. Rather than the 15,000 troops Martin had heard of, the British had assembled a force of 25,000 men in New York. More than 400 British ships floated in the harbor. This was the biggest army and the largest fleet the British had ever sent overseas. In the face of such overwhelming force, the Americans should have been easily defeated, but they were not. In this chapter, you will read how soldiers like Joseph Martin stood up to the mighty Great Britain, and in a successful revolution that created a new nation. All right, so down to 7.2 and 7.3. What we're looking for here are American strengths and weaknesses. Now, I'm sure some of you probably already know these off the top of your head, but let's take a look at those right here. Here we go. 7.2, the Patriots, okay, synonymous with the colonists here. The Patriots were in a weak position when the American Revolution began. They had a hastily organized, untrained army and a small navy. Their weaknesses were far more obvious than their strengths. American weaknesses. The Continental Army was always short of men. General George Washington had never had more than 20,000 troops at one time and place. Many soldiers enlisted for 6 months or a year. When they were just learning how to fight, they would pick up their muskets and go home and take care of their families, their farms and families. Few Americans were trained for battle. Some were hunters and could shoot well enough from behind a tree. But when facing a mass of well-disciplined redcoats, they were likely to turn and run. The army was plagued by shortages. Guns and gunpowder were so scarce that Benjamin Franklin suggested arming troops with bows and arrows. Wowee. Food shortages forced soldiers to beg for handouts. Uniforms were scarce as well. In winter, one could track shoeless soldiers by their bloody footprints in the snow. Such shortages outraged Washington, but when he complained to the Second Continental Congress, nothing happened. Congress, the nation's only government, lacked the power to raise money for supplies by taxing the colonies. Now the new nation's states. In desperation, Congress printed paper money to pay for the war, but the value of money dropped so low that merchants demanded to be paid in gold instead. Like everything else, gold was scarce. American strengths. Still, the Americans did have strengths. One was the patriotism of people like Joseph Martin, who willingly gave their lives to defend the ideal of a country based on liberty and democracy. Without them, the war would have been quickly lost. The Americans also received help from overseas. Motivated by their old hatred of the British, the French secretly aided the Americans. During the first 2 years of the war, 90% of American gunpowder came from Europe, mostly from France. In addition, a Polish Jew named Chaim Solomon, who immigrated to New York in 1775, helped to finance the war effort. The Americans' other great strength was their commander. General Washington was more than an experienced military leader. He was also a man who inspired courage and confidence. In the dark days to come, it was Washington who would keep the ragtag Continental Army together. Yeah, interestingly enough, George Washington was a general in the British Army fighting in the French and Indian War just previous to this. So he had pretty good ideas about how the British Army worked, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, here we go. 7.3, this is the one you're really going to want to pay attention to because we're going to be doing something with this, well, and this, but here we go. In contrast to the American colonies, Great Britain entered the war from a position of strength. Yet, despite both their real and perceived advantages, the British forces encountered many problems. British strengths. With a professional army of about 42,000 troops at the beginning of the war, British forces greatly outnumbered the Continental Army. In addition, George III hired 30,000 mercenaries from Germany. These hired soldiers were known as Hessians because they came from a part of Germany called Hesse-Kassel. The British were also able to recruit many loyalists, African Americans, and American Indians to fight on their side. British and Hessian troops were well trained in European military tactics. They excelled in large battles fought by a mass of troops on open ground. They also had far more experience firing artillery than Americans had. The British forces were well supplied as well. Unlike the pitifully equipped Continental Army, they seldom lacked for food, uniforms, weapons, or ammunition. Here we go, British weaknesses. Even so, the war presented Great Britain with huge problems. One was the distance between Great Britain and America. Sending troops and supplies across the Atlantic was slow and costly. News of battles arrived in England long after they had occurred, making it difficult for British leaders to plan a course of action. A second problem was that King George and his ministers were never able to convince the British people that defeating the rebels was vital to the future of Great Britain. So imagine being one of those soldiers fighting in the Americas, knowing that they were just wanted their independence anyway. I mean, what was their incentive to fight? Sorry, I'll keep reading. The longer the war dragged on, the less happy the British taxpayers became about paying its heavy costs. A third problem was poor leadership. Lord George Germain, the man chosen to direct British troops, had no real sense of how to defeat the rebels. How could he? He had never set foot in North America, nor did it occur to him to go see for himself what his army was up against. If he had, Germain might have realized that this was not a war that could be won by conquering a city or two. To end this revolution, Germain's forces would have to crush the Patriots' will to fight, state by state. Instead, Germain kept changing plans and generals, hoping that some combination of the two would bring him an easy victory. And that's kind of an interesting point, folks, is that this is a war of attrition. George Washington and the Colonials did not win too many battles. They won very few. In fact, when you fight a war of attrition, you just want to be annoying for long enough so that the British will go, is this really worth it? Do we really want to keep putting money and effort and bodies and lives into this thing? Okay, so keep that in mind as you are learning about the American Revolution. So here's what I want you to do now. Now I want you to go to that sheet, the one that you put into Notability, that PDF. Let's take a look at that. So list 3 strengths of the British at the start of the war. Can anybody give me one strength of the British at the start of the war?
The numbers.
Yeah. Numbers in the troops. And these were people that had fought before. They were trained to be actual soldiers. Okay, this was their job. So they were professional soldiers, and they were good, and there were a lot of them. And they had actually fought in a war before. Any other strengths?
They had hired mercenaries from Germany.
And those mercenaries scared the bejesus out of the colonials. The Hessians were scary. They were the most disciplined, well-trained soldiers in the world. And they never lost. And to think the colonials were going to be going up against mercenaries? So I think we got 3 there. Okay. List 2 weaknesses of the British at the start of the war. Anybody got one? You know, they mentioned a couple there. What were some weaknesses of the British?
The distance between Great Britain and America.
It took weeks. So let's say a battle occurred. They'd send the news over the sea. It'd take weeks to get there, and then whatever orders the King George III wanted to send back, that took weeks to get back. Okay, so they didn't get news of things, like they didn't get news of their surrender at Yorktown for weeks until after it happened. And then they mentioned one other one. What was that? They mentioned one other one. What was one more?
They had trouble convincing the British people that this fight was even worth it.
Yeah, the incentive to fight. I mean, why did they even want to be there, right? I mean, what was the point? You know, going and fighting for somebody that doesn't want you there, you know, this is a larger conversation that we'll have much later. But like when you're fighting a war of insurgents, fighting against insurgents who don't want you there, that's a very difficult conversation. That's a very difficult. How do you convince somebody that, you know, well, you're going to be a part of it's like a bad breakup, right? Like we're going to be together. No, we're not. Well, where do you go from there, right? And then the other one that they mentioned was just poor leadership. Is that the British generals didn't necessarily know the landscape. They didn't know how to fight in the Americas, and the distance between the kind of the chain of command was a real problem. And they kept replacing generals one after one. Okay, one after another. Excuse me. All right. So number 3, complete the annotations for the map in round 1 of Capture the Flag. So what we've got here is a metaphor. This game of Capture the Flag is going to stand as a metaphor for what we're talking about. The blue team is smaller. Now, is the blue team actually smaller in size, or what do you think that's representing? Well, probably the numbers, okay? So the blue team is smaller in numbers, okay? It has not warmed up. What do you think that means? It has not warmed up. It hasn't played Capture the Flag as much as the red team. It has not warmed up. It hasn't played Capture the Flag as much as the red team. What the rip does that mean?
Lack of experience and training.
Yeah, the colonists they had to learn how to march. They had never fought in a battle. They had never fought in a war. The British have fought on several continents and were the most, you know, a part of the most powerful organization in the world. They had fought in several wars, mainly against the French, okay, in every continent. So for this, we could write, it hasn't played Capture the Flag as much as the red team, just like the colonists had never fought in a war before, okay? So vice versa, the red team is larger. So we would annotate over here that the red team is representing the British, okay, so here are the red coats. It has warmed up, meaning it has fought in a battle before. It has fought in a war before. It has played Capture the Flag more than the blue team because the British had actually fought and were a dominant force. Okay, they were a dominant team. Okay, I mean, I know that you guys probably get tired of sports analogies, but like, I mean, this is an all-star team versus a JV rookie team that has no business, you know, fighting against them. Okay, people predicted that this war would be over in a matter of weeks. Okay, because the might of the British Army was just that. Okay, so here we go. The blue team's captain has experience playing Capture the Flag, just like, who do you think we're looking at here? Who's the blue team's captain that has experience playing Capture the Flag?
George Washington.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a more difficult one, though. The white team, here's a white team on the sideline. I know you can't see the colors in here because it's black and white, but here's blue and here's red. Okay, so the red's bigger, the blue's smaller. We see a white team on the sideline here. A white team cheers for the blue team, just like, so we talked about the British. The French. The French. Yeah, the French wanted the Americans to win because this was basically the middle of their world war that they were fighting against the English. They were fighting for colonies all over the world, okay, in every continent. Okay, and the French are going to be allies with the Americans. So half of the red team starts the game far away from the field. Half of the red team starts the game far away from the field. What is that representing?
The distance between America and Britain.
Yeah, very good. Okay. How far it was away from the Americas to Great Britain. Very good. So that's what I'm looking for here, folks. Okay, so I did that first one for you. You're going to move on and go 7.4 to 7.8 using the reading. You can see where that's due in Schoology. Any questions about how this is going to be submitted? Or excuse me, how this is going to be completed? No? Well, all right then, folks. Here's what I want you to do. Okay? in a moment, but not yet. In a moment, but not yet, I want you to go on to Schoology and I want you to take that quiz, okay? So there's going to be 3 matching sections dealing with the terms, and there's going to be 1 matching section dealing with that map, dealing with the bigger chunks of U.S. land acquisition, okay? I will stick around, so as soon as you're done with the quiz, you can check out, you don't even need to say bye, you can just leave. But I'm going to stick around to answer any questions that any of you might have regarding the spectrum activity, the foreign policy spectrum, or anything else you want to talk about, okay? So I will be here, and I am going to open up the quiz right now. Almost there. Almost there. Almost there. All right, the quiz is now available. Good luck. And one person emailed me asking if you have to stay on for this. And the only reason I'm having you stay on for this is sometimes, you get a problem with your quiz and I have to reopen it for you. And it's just easier if you just stay on until you're done. So sorry about me talking during your quiz.